The bitter wind of December 26, 1776, howled across the Delaware River as if nature herself mourned the dying cause of American independence. General George Washington stood at the bow of Durham boat, his weathered face etched with the weight of a revolution teetering on the edge of collapse. Behind him, 2,400 Continental soldiers huddled against the freezing rain, their ragged uniforms barely distinguishing them from common vagrants. The American cause had never looked more hopeless. Just months earlier, the Continental Army had suffered crushing defeats in New York, forcing a humiliating retreat across New Jersey. Enlistments were expiring faster than Washington could recruit new soldiers, and the Continental Congress had fled Philadelphia in panic. Many colonists who had initially supported the rebellion were now questioning whether independence was worth the devastating cost. Thomas Paine's words from the crisis echoed in Washington's mind. These are the times that try men's souls. Indeed, these were such times. The British forces, led by General William Howe, controlled most of New York and New Jersey, while Hessian mercenaries, German soldiers hired by King George III, had established winter quarters in towns across the region. The professional European army seemed invincible against the ragtag American forces. Washington knew that without a decisive victory, the Continental Army would dissolve entirely by New Year's Day. Desertion rates were climbing, supplies were nearly exhausted, and morale had plummeted to its lowest points since the war began. The general had witnessed grown men weep openly as they abandoned their posts, unable to endure another day of hunger and cold without pay. The plan forming in Washington's mind was audacious to the point of desperation. Intelligence reports suggested that the Hessian garrison at Trenton, numbering approximately 1,500 men under Colonel Johann Rall, had grown complacent in their winter quarters. The German mercenaries, believing the Americans were too demoralized to mount any significant offensive, had settled into a routine of heavy drinking and minimal vigilance. As the boats pushed through the ice-choked Delaware, Washington observed his men with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Many were shoeless, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. Others wrapped their feet in cloth torn from their own clothing. Yet despite their suffering, they had answered his call for one final gamble. These were farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers who had left their families and livelihoods to fight for an ideal that seemed increasingly impossible to achieve. The crossing itself was a nightmare of logistics and endurance. The river, swollen with winter rains and clogged with ice, threatened to claim lives before the battle even began. John Glover's Marblehead fishermen, experienced in handling boats in treacherous waters, worked tirelessly to ferry the army across. Artillery pieces, horses, and supply wagons added to the complexity of the operation, requiring multiple trips through the dangerous waters. By the time the last soldier reached the New Jersey shore, it was nearly 4 a.m. The original plan had called for a pre-dawn attack, but the crossing had taken far longer than anticipated. Washington faced a critical decision: abort the mission and return to Pennsylvania, or press forward despite the delay and risk attacking in daylight. The decision came without hesitation. Washington had not risked everything: his army, his reputation, and the very survival of the revolution, only to retreat at the first sign of difficulty. He gave the order to march on Trenton, knowing that failure would likely mean the end of American independence and his own execution as a traitor to the crown. The 9-mile march to Trenton tested every man's resolve. The storm that had complicated their river crossing now worked in their favor, muffling the sound of their approach and keeping Hessian sentries indoors. Snow mixed with sleet created a treacherous path, but it also provided cover for the advancing army. Washington had divided his forces into 2 columns, one led by himself and General Nathanael Greene, the other by General John Sullivan. As they approached the outskirts of Trenton, Washington's thoughts turned to the broader implications of their mission. The American cause needed more than just a military victory. It needed a symbol that would reignite the revolutionary spirit across the 13 colonies. News of repeated defeats had spread throughout the land, causing many to question whether resistance to British rule was futile. The town of Trenton itself was a modest settlement of perhaps 100 houses, strategically located along the Delaware River. The Hessians had chosen it as winter quarters precisely because of its comfortable accommodations and apparent security. Colonel Rall, a veteran of European campaigns, had dismissed warnings about potential American attacks. "Let them come," he had reportedly said. "We will go at them with the bayonet." This context regarding Hessian overconfidence has been documented in various historical accounts, including those found in the National Archives and early American military histories. Washington's intelligence network, led by spies like John Honeyman, had provided crucial information about Hessian routines and defenses. The Germans typically maintained 3 outposts around the town, but their vigilance had declined significantly since Christmas Day. Many of the mercenaries had celebrated the holiday with considerable quantities of alcohol, and their officers had grown lax in enforcing military discipline. The plan of attack was elegantly simple yet incredibly risky. Greene's column would enter Trenton from the north, while Sullivan's forces would approach from the west. The coordinated assault would begin at precisely 8 o'clock in the morning, catching the Hessians before they could organize an effective defense. Captain Alexander Hamilton and other artillery officers would play crucial roles in controlling the town's main streets with cannon fire. As the 2 columns separated to take their positions, Washington felt the familiar weight of command settling upon his shoulders. Every decision in the coming hours would be scrutinized by history. Assuming anyone survived to record it, the men following him represented the last best hope for American independence. If they failed here, the revolution would die with them in the streets of Trenton. The weather continued to deteriorate as they approached the town. What had begun as snow had transformed into a mixture of sleet and freezing rain that made every step treacherous. Yet Washington recognized that these same conditions that tormented his men would also work to their advantage. No reasonable military commander would expect an attack in such weather, especially from an army that had been in full retreat just weeks earlier. The first light of dawn was still hours away when Washington's column reached the outskirts of Trenton. Through the gloom, they could see the dim outlines of houses where Hessian soldiers slept peacefully, unaware that their comfortable winter quarters were about to become a battleground. The general checked his pocket watch. Nearly 8 o'clock. Soon, the fate of the American Revolution would be decided in the streets of a small New Jersey town. The attack commenced with a violence that shattered the morning stillness like a thunderclap. Captain Alexander Hamilton's artillery pieces, positioned at the head of King Street and Queen Street, opened fire with a roar that echoed off the frozen buildings of Trenton. The Hessian soldiers, roused from their warm beds by the sound of cannon fire, stumbled into the streets in various states of undress, struggling to comprehend what was happening. Colonel Johann Rall, the Hessian commander, had been awakened by his adjutant with the alarming news that the town was under attack. Still suffering from the effects of Christmas celebrations, Rall initially dismissed the reports as exaggerated accounts of a minor skirmish. It's probably just a few farmers making noise, he reportedly told his officers. This fatal underestimation would cost him dearly. Washington, mounted on his horse and positioned where he could observe the entire battle, watched with grim satisfaction as his plan unfolded. The surprise was complete. Hessian soldiers ran through the streets in confusion, some still in their night clothes, others desperately trying to locate their weapons and equipment. The months of careful intelligence gathering and meticulous planning were paying dividends. General Sullivan's column attacked from the west simultaneously, creating panic among the Hessian forces who found themselves caught between 2 advancing American forces. The professional German soldiers, trained in the formal warfare of European battlefields, were unprepared for the swift, coordinated assault that struck them from multiple directions. Their standard defensive formations, so effective against conventional armies, proved inadequate against Washington's unconventional tactics. The narrow streets of Trenton became a maze of confusion and combat. Hessian officers shouted orders in German while their men struggled to form defensive lines under the withering fire of American muskets and artillery. The sounds of battle musket fire, cannon blasts, shouting men, and screaming horses created a cacophony that could be heard for miles. Across the frozen New Jersey countryside, Captain William Washington, the general's cousin, led a charge of mounted soldiers down King Street, his sword gleaming in the dim morning light. The sight of American cavalry charging through the town center further demoralized the Hessian defenders, who had been told that the Continental Army was too weak and disorganized to mount any significant offensive operations. Within minutes of the attacks beginning, American forces had captured the 2 main artillery pieces that the Hessians had positioned in the town square. These cannons, now turned against their former owners, began firing down the streets at fleeing German soldiers. The irony was not lost on Washington weapons. that had been intended to defend against American attack were now being used to complete their victory. Colonel Rahl, finally grasping the seriousness of the situation, attempted to rally his troops in an orchard south of the town. Mounted on his horse and shouting commands, he tried to organize a counterattack that might allow the Hessians to escape the trap that had been sprung around them. For a brief moment, it appeared that his efforts might succeed as German soldiers began to form ranks. However, American marksmen had taken positions in buildings overlooking the orchard. A volley of musket fire struck the Hessian formation, and Colonel Rahl himself was mortally wounded, struck by the bullets that knocked him from his horse. With their commander fallen and their situation hopeless, the remaining Hessian resistance began to crumble. The battle, which had begun with such fury, was rapidly approaching its conclusion. Less than an hour after the first shots were fired, organized Hessian resistance had effectively ceased. Groups of German soldiers threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender, while others fled southward toward Princeton, hoping to escape the American trap. Washington observed the scene with a mixture of relief and amazement. The gamble had succeeded beyond his most optimistic expectations. The professional Hessian force, considered among the finest soldiers in the world, had been decisively defeated by an army that many had written off as finished. The aftermath of the battle revealed the completeness of Washington's victory. As the morning sun finally broke through the winter clouds, it illuminated a scene that would have been unimaginable just hours earlier. Nearly 900 Hessian soldiers sat in the town square as prisoners of war, their hands bound and their faces reflecting the shock of their unexpected defeat. The supposedly invincible German mercenaries had been thoroughly routed by the same rabble they had been hired to suppress. The casualty count told an even more remarkable story. The Continental Army had suffered only 2 deaths during the entire battle. Both soldiers, who had frozen to death during the march rather than falling to enemy fire. Several men were wounded, including future President James Monroe, who was struck by a musket ball but survived to serve his country for decades to come. In contrast, the Hessians had lost 22 dead, including their commander Colonel Rahl, and 98 wounded. Washington walked among the prisoners, observing the faces of men who had awakened that morning expecting another routine day of occupation duty. Many of the German soldiers were young, not much older than his own Continental troops, and he felt a measure of sympathy for their plight. They had been hired by a distant king to fight in a war that was not their own, and now they found themselves captives in a foreign land. The captured supplies proved almost as valuable as the prisoners themselves. The Hessians had been well equipped for their winter quarters, and the Americans desperately needed everything they could find: muskets, ammunition, artillery pieces, horses, food, and medical supplies. For soldiers who had been surviving on minimal rations and inadequate equipment, these captured stores represented a lifeline that would sustain them through the remainder of winter. Perhaps most importantly, the victory at Trenton provided something that no amount of supplies could purchase: hope. Word of the triumph spread rapidly throughout the colonies, carried by riders who galloped from town to town with the incredible news. The same Continental Army that had been in full retreat just weeks earlier had struck back with stunning effectiveness, proving that the British and their allies were not invincible after all. The psychological impact of the victory extended far beyond military considerations. Colonial newspapers, which had been filled with accounts of American defeats and British victories, suddenly had a different story to tell. The Pennsylvania Journal proclaimed the victory as evidence that divine providence favored the American cause, while other publications used the battle to rally support for continued resistance against British rule. This transformation in public opinion has been well documented in contemporary newspaper accounts and colonial correspondence, as preserved in various historical archives and collections. General Washington understood that his victory, while significant, was only the beginning of a longer campaign. The British forces under General Howe would certainly respond to the defeat of their Hessian allies, and the Continental Army needed to be prepared for retaliation. However, the morale boost provided by Trenton had already begun to pay dividends in terms of recruitment and public support. The treatment of prisoners became an important consideration for Washington, who was keenly aware that his army's conduct would be scrutinized by both allies and enemies. He issued strict orders that the captured Hessians were to be treated humanely, in accordance with the principles of civilized warfare. This decision reflected both his personal character and his understanding that the American cause would be judged by its adherence to moral standards. As the day progressed, Washington faced the challenge of consolidating his victory while preparing for the next phase of operations. The success at Trenton had opened new possibilities for the Continental Army, but it had also exposed them to increased British attention. The general knew that General Howe would not allow such a humiliating defeat to go unanswered, and American forces needed to be ready for whatever response the British might mount. The men who had crossed the Delaware in darkness and desperation now stood as victors in the streets of Trenton, their faces reflecting a transformation that went far beyond military success. They had proven to themselves and to the world that they were capable of defeating professional European forces, and this knowledge would sustain them through the trials that lay ahead. The news of Washington's victory at Trenton spread across the 13 colonies like wildfire, igniting a renewed enthusiasm for the revolutionary cause that had seemed all but extinguished. In Philadelphia, members of the Continental Congress, who had fled the city in panic just weeks earlier, began to speak of returning to the capital. The victory had given them something they had desperately needed: proof that the Continental Army could not only survive, but actually defeat the enemy. Thomas Paine, whose earlier writings had helped inspire the Revolution, immediately recognized the significance of the Trenton victory. He began composing another installment of the crisis, understanding that Washington's triumph provided the perfect opportunity to rebuild American morale and commitment to independence. The victory had transformed the narrative from one of inevitable defeat to one of possible triumph through perseverance and courage. In taverns and meeting houses throughout New England, men who had been reluctant to enlist in the Continental Army began reconsidering their position. The victory at Trenton proved that service in Washington's forces was not necessarily a death sentence, and that the American cause might actually have a chance of success. Recruitment offices that had been virtually empty for months began to see an increase in volunteers. The impact extended beyond American borders as well. In France, where diplomats like Benjamin Franklin had been working tirelessly to secure foreign support for the Revolution, news of Trenton provided crucial ammunition for their arguments. French officials who had been skeptical about American chances of victory began to take a more serious interest in the possibility of an alliance. The victory suggested that the Americans might actually be capable of sustaining a prolonged resistance against British power. King Louis XVI's court at Versailles received detailed reports about the battle, and French military advisors began to assess whether the Americans might be worthy of more substantial support. The French had their own reasons for opposing British power, but they were reluctant to commit resources to a losing cause. Trenton changed the calculation by demonstrating that the Continental Army could achieve significant victories against professional European forces. Back in Trenton, Washington faced the immediate challenge of deciding what to do next. The victory had been so complete and so unexpected that it had created new opportunities, but it had also increased the risks facing his army. British forces under General Howe would certainly mount a response to the humiliating defeat of their Hessian allies, and Washington needed to be prepared for whatever form that response might take. The general convened a council of war with his senior officers to discuss their options. Some argued for withdrawing back across the Delaware to Pennsylvania, consolidating their gains and avoiding the risk of a British counterattack. Others suggested that the momentum from Trenton should be used to launch additional attacks against British positions throughout New Jersey. Washington himself favored a more aggressive approach. He recognized that the psychological impact of Trenton would be diminished if the Continental Army immediately returned to a defensive posture. The victory had provided an opportunity to keep the British off balance, and he believed that opportunity should not be wasted. However, he also understood that his army's capabilities were limited, and that overreach could lead to disaster. The decision was further complicated by the approaching New Year. Many of the Continental soldiers' enlistments were due to expire on December 31st, and there was no guarantee that they would agree to extend their service. The victory at Trenton had improved morale, but it had not resolved the fundamental problems of pay, supplies, and conditions that made military service so difficult for colonial soldiers. This challenge regarding enlistments and army organization is detailed in various military correspondence and memoirs from the period, including those housed in the Library of Congress and other historical repositories. Washington addressed his troops directly, appealing to their patriotism and their sense of honor. He reminded them that the victory at Trenton had been achieved through their courage and sacrifice, and that abandoning the cause now would waste everything they had accomplished. He also made practical appeals, offering bonuses and improved conditions for those who would agree to extend their service. The response was mixed, but ultimately positive. While some soldiers insisted on returning home when their enlistments expired, a significant number agreed to remain with the Army for at least 6 more weeks. This extension would provide Washington with enough time to plan and execute additional operations while reinforcements could be recruited and trained. The victory at Trenton had fundamentally changed the character of the Revolutionary War. What had begun as a desperate gamble by a failing army had become the foundation for a renewed American resistance that would ultimately lead to independence. General William Howe's headquarters in New York erupted in fury when news of the Trenton disaster reached British commanders. The defeat of an entire Hessian regiment by what they had dismissed as a ragtag colonial militia represented more than just a military setback. It was a humiliating blow to British prestige and their reputation for invincibility. Howe, who had been planning to conclude active operations for the winter, now faced the urgent necessity of responding forcefully to Washington's audacious attack. The British commander immediately dispatched orders to General Charles Cornwallis, who had been preparing to return to England for the winter season. Cornwallis, one of Britain's most experienced and aggressive generals, was commanded to assemble a force capable of crushing Washington's army once and for all. The defeat at Trenton had made the Americans dangerous, and Howe was determined to ensure that they would not have another opportunity to embarrass British arms. Cornwallis gathered approximately 8,000 British and Hessian troops from garrisons throughout New Jersey and New York. This force, nearly 4 times larger than Washington's army, represented some of the finest soldiers in the British Empire. Professional regiments that had served in European campaigns were combined with fresh Hessian units, eager to avenge their comrades' defeat at Trenton. The British strategy was straightforward: locate Washington's army and destroy it completely. Intelligence reports suggested that the Americans were still in the Trenton area, apparently emboldened by their recent success. Cornwallis planned to advance rapidly with overwhelming force, surrounding the Continental Army before it could escape. Back across the Delaware River, however, Washington had not been idle since his victory at Trenton. Recognizing that a British response was inevitable, he had been working to strengthen his position while planning his next moves. The general understood that remaining static in Trenton would be suicidal, but he also recognized that the momentum from his victory needed to be maintained through continued aggressive action. On January 2, 1777, Cornwallis began his advance toward Trenton with supreme confidence. The British general had never been defeated in battle, and he viewed the coming engagement as an opportunity to restore British prestige while eliminating the troublesome American army. His forces moved with the precision and discipline that had made British arms feared throughout Europe. Washington, however, had no intention of fighting a conventional battle against superior numbers. His success at Trenton had demonstrated the value of unconventional tactics, and he planned to use similar methods against Cornwallis. The American commander positioned his forces in strong defensive positions around Trenton, while preparing for what would become one of the most audacious maneuvers in military history. As Cornwallis approached Trenton, his advance guard encountered fierce resistance from American forces positioned along the Sunpink Creek. The fighting was intense, with both sides suffering casualties as British troops attempted to force their way across the creek. However, the Americans held their positions, preventing the British from immediately overwhelming the town. By evening, Cornwallis had established his forces in position surrounding Trenton. Confident that he had trapped Washington's army, the British general posted guards along all possible escape routes and prepared for what he expected to be a decisive battle the following morning. "We've got the old fox safe now," Cornwallis reportedly told his officers. "We'll go over and bag him in the morning." The confidence in the British camp was palpable. Officers celebrated the apparent success of their operation, while soldiers prepared for what they expected to be an easy victory against the colonial rebels. The defeat at Trenton had been an embarrassment, but it was about to be avenged in spectacular fashion. This account of British confidence and strategic planning is drawn from various contemporary British military correspondence and memoirs, as documented in historical archives and scholarly works on the Revolutionary War. Unknown to Cornwallis, Washington was already implementing a plan that would once again demonstrate the American capacity for military innovation. Rather than waiting to be attacked in the morning, the Continental Army was preparing for another nighttime maneuver that would catch the British completely off guard. As midnight approached, Washington's forces began one of the most daring movements in military history. The general had decided to abandon Trenton entirely, but not in retreat. Instead, he would march his army around the British forces and attack their rear guard at Princeton. It was a gamble that would either result in another stunning victory or complete disaster for the American cause. The night of January 2nd to 3rd, 1777, would prove to be one of the most crucial in American military history. While General Cornwallis slept peacefully in his headquarters, confident that he had trapped Washington's army, the Continental forces were executing one of the most audacious maneuvers ever attempted in warfare. Under cover of darkness, nearly 5,000 American soldiers began a silent march around the British positions, leaving behind only a skeleton force to maintain campfires and create the illusion of a full army. Still in position, Washington's plan was breathtaking in its boldness. Rather than await the inevitable British attack that would come with dawn, he chose to abandon Trenton entirely and strike at the British rear guard stationed at Princeton. The route required a 16-mile march through frozen countryside, with the constant risk of discovery by British patrols. If Cornwallis detected the movement, the Continental Army would be caught in the open and destroyed. The march itself tested every man's endurance and discipline, moving in near complete silence. The soldiers wrapped their weapons and equipment to prevent any sound that might alert British sentries. The same winter weather that had aided them at Trenton now worked against them, as snow muffled their footsteps but also made the journey treacherous. Many men left bloody footprints in the snow, their makeshift shoes providing little protection against the frozen ground. By dawn on January 3rd, Washington's army had successfully circled the British positions and was approaching Princeton. From the northeast, the town housed approximately 1,200 British troops under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood. These forces, confident in their security behind Cornwallis's main army, were completely unprepared for the attack that was about to descend upon them. The Battle of Princeton began when American advance forces encountered a British column that was marching to reinforce Cornwallis at Trenton. The collision was unexpected for both sides, but the Americans recovered more quickly from their surprise. Captain Alexander Hamilton once again distinguished himself with his artillery, while General Hugh Mercer led a flanking attack that initially succeeded in disrupting the British formation. However, the battle's opening phase went badly for the Americans. General Mercer was mortally wounded when his horse was shot from under him, and British bayonet charges scattered several American units. For a moment, it appeared that Washington's bold gamble might end in disaster, with his army defeated in detail while separated from any possibility of retreat. At this critical moment, Washington himself rode forward into the heaviest fighting, mounted on his white horse and seemingly oblivious to the musket balls whistling around him. The general rallied his troops through personal example. His presence on the battlefield inspired the Continental soldiers to reform their ranks and renew their attack with increased determination. The tide of battle turned when American forces managed to capture Nassau Hall, the main building of the College of New Jersey, now Princeton University. This position dominated the town and provided a base from which artillery could command the surrounding area. British resistance began to crumble as their defensive positions became untenable. Lieutenant Colonel Mawhood, recognizing that his position was hopeless, ordered a general retreat toward New Brunswick. The British withdrawal quickly became a rout as American forces pursued the fleeing enemy. Through the streets of Princeton, the victory was complete, with the Americans capturing supplies, prisoners, and artillery while suffering minimal casualties. The psychological impact of the Princeton victory was even greater than that of Trenton. In the span of 10 days, Washington had achieved stunning victories against professional European forces, transforming the Continental Army from a defeated rabble into a formidable military organization. The old fox had not only escaped Cornwallis's trap, but had turned the tables entirely. Cornwallis, awakening to discover that his quarry had vanished, and hearing the sound of artillery fire from Princeton, faced one of the most embarrassing moments of his military career. The American army that he had planned to destroy at dawn had instead struck at his rear. While he slept, the general immediately ordered a rapid march toward Princeton, but by the time his forces arrived, Washington had already withdrawn to winter quarters in Morristown. The twin victories of Trenton and Princeton had fundamentally altered the character of the Revolutionary War. What had begun as a desperate gamble by a failing army had become the foundation for ultimate American victory. The revolution that had seemed doomed just days earlier was now reinvigorated. With renewed support from colonial populations and increased interest from potential foreign allies, Washington's army, though still small and poorly equipped, had proven that it could not only survive, but actually defeat the supposedly invincible British forces. The battles had created a legend that would sustain American morale through the dark years ahead, and ultimately lead to independence. The crossing of the Delaware and the surprise attack on Trenton had indeed revived the spirit of the failing revolution, setting the stage for the birth of a new nation. The winter quarters at Morristown provided time for reflection on what had been accomplished. In the space of 10 days, Washington had saved the revolution, transformed his army's reputation, and established himself as one of history's great military commanders. The battles of Trenton and Princeton would be remembered as the moment when American independence changed from an impossible dream to an achievable reality.